Margaret Sullivan saw death coming at dawn. It came on silent horses, flowing through the morning mist like a bad dream. She was checking on her father, his body burning with fever, when the shadows outside her window took the shape of men. Apache warriors. Her scream caught in her throat, a cold knot of terror, 1 second of paralysis. That's all it took. By the time she moved, the first war cry ripped the world in two. She ran for her father's room, her feet pounding on the rough wooden floor. "Papa, get up! Get the rifle!" But James Sullivan was lost in the fog of sickness, his eyes open but seeing nothing. He muttered names she didn't know, lost in a past she couldn't reach. Outside, the world was ending, the sounds of splintering wood, the terrified screams of their livestock. Margaret knew with a chilling certainty that they were already dead. She snatched the heavy Winchester from the wall, the cold metal a small comfort in her trembling hands. She levered around into the chamber, the click echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. She fired through the window once, twice. A shadow fell, but more took its place. Then the door buckled, the frame splintering inward. The first warrior who burst through met the third bullet. He crumpled without a sound. But then another was on her, and another. The rifle was torn from her grip, her world a blur of painted faces and dark, pitiless eyes. She fought like a cornered animal. She clawed, she bit, she grabbed a kitchen knife from the table and plunged it into a leg, a shoulder, anything she could reach. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. A blow from a war club struck the side of her head. The world shattered into 1,000 points of light, and then, mercifully, there was only darkness. The very last thing she heard was a sound from her father's room, a weak cry cut brutally short, a sound that would live in her nightmares for the rest of her life, if she had a rest of her life. Margaret woke up to a world that was moving. Her body swayed with the rhythm of a horse's gait, and for a wild, hopeful second, she thought maybe she was in a wagon. Maybe her father was taking her to town. But the smell hit her first. Sweat, blood, smoke, and a wild, musky scent she couldn't place. She cracked open her swollen eyes. The ground was a dizzying blur below her. She was slung over a horse like a sack of flour, her wrists tied tight with rawhide. Her head felt like it had been split open with an axe. She tried to call out, but her throat was a desert, and only a dry croak came out. The Apache warrior leading her horse glanced back. His face was a mask of red and black paint, his eyes as empty as a winter sky. He looked through her, not at her, like she was cargo. Nothing more. They rode all day. The sun beat down, baking the land, baking her skin. They only stopped once to let the horses drink from a muddy creek. No water was offered to her. She was property, and she was beginning to understand what that meant. As the sun bled across the horizon, they finally reached a camp huddled in the shadow of a rock formation. There were other warriors there, and other captives. Two Mexican women huddled together, their eyes hollowed out by horrors Margaret could only begin to imagine, and a young white boy, no older than 12, who sat perfectly still, his face a blank mask of shock. He didn't even seem to be breathing. Margaret was shoved to the ground near them. Her bonds were checked, pulled even tighter, but not removed. Someone kicked a gourd of water toward her. She drank, the water tasting of dirt and life itself. The warriors gathered around their fire, their voices a low, guttural murmur. They kept glancing over at the captives, and Margaret didn't need to speak their language to know they were discussing their fate. She tried to meet the eyes of the Mexican women, searching for some spark of connection, of shared humanity. But they looked away. They already knew the truth she was just starting to learn. Their old lives were gone, burned to the ground with their homes. Survival now had a different price, a price she didn't know if she could pay. That night, lying on the cold, hard ground, Margaret tried not to think. She tried not to see her father's face, not to hear that final awful sound. She tried not to imagine what would happen to her, to the boy, to the women. But then she heard it, a new sound that cut through the night and froze the blood in her veins. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming fast. The camp exploded into chaos. Warriors leaped to their feet, grabbing weapons, their low talk turning to sharp, angry shouts. A sliver of hope, sharp and painful, pierced Margaret's despair. Were they being rescued? Cavalry? But the hope died as quickly as it was born. The war cries that echoed from the darkness were not from soldiers. And the way the Apaches answered, with a rage that felt ancient and personal, told her everything. These weren't rescuers. This was an old hatred, a blood feud playing out under the moonless sky. These were Comanches. The world became a storm of violence. The night was lit by the flash of rifles and the dying orange glow of the cook fire. Margaret and the other captives flattened themselves against the earth, trying to become invisible as the battle raged around them. Men screamed and died in the dark. She saw an arrow sprout from a man's throat. She saw a skull collapse under a stone war club. She saw the glint of knives as men fought chest to chest, their grunts of effort turning into wet gurgles. In the swirling chaos, someone stumbled over her, and their knife accidentally sliced through her bonds. She didn't know if it was Apache or Comanche, and she didn't care. She was free. She began to crawl low to the ground, away from the firelight and toward the deeper shadows at the edge of the camp. Escape was her only thought, just to get away from the death and the screaming. She was almost there, the darkness just feet away, when a hand tangled in her hair and yanked her back with brutal force. An Apache warrior loomed over her. Blood poured from a gush on his shoulder, his face a mask of pain and fury. He raised his knife, the blade catching the firelight. This was it. This was her end. But the knife never fell. Out of the darkness, a shape materialized. A Comanche warrior, his body a fluid wedge of violence. His war lance, a thing of horrifying beauty, took the Apache clean through the chest. The force was so great it lifted the man off his feet before slamming him back to the ground. The Comanche stood over her, his chest heaving. His face was painted in stark patterns of black and white, making him look like a spirit of vengeance. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the lance to find her next. But it didn't happen. Instead, he grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron, but it wasn't cruel. He hauled her to her feet. "Run!" he grunted, his English thick with an accent she couldn't place. He pointed to a jumble of large boulders on the far side of the clearing. "Hide!" She didn't wait to be told twice. She didn't question this bizarre miracle. She just ran. She stumbled over bodies, her bare feet slipping in something wet and warm. She reached the rocks just as she heard the sounds of pursuit behind her. She squeezed herself into a narrow crevice, pulling her body into the tightest ball she could manage, and listened. The sounds of the battle continued for what felt like an eternity, but slowly the screams and shouts died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded. When the first hint of gray light touched the sky, the fighting was over. The camp was silent. The Comanches had won. Margaret stayed hidden, her body trembling uncontrollably. Had the warrior's mercy been a whim of the moment? Would stepping out of the rocks mean trading one captor for another? She peeked through a crack in the rocks. The scene was carnage. Bodies from both tribes were scattered across the ground. The victorious Comanches were moving through the camp, tending their wounded, collecting weapons and horses from the dead. They were preparing to leave. And then she saw him, the warrior who had saved her. He was tall, moving with an easy grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He was giving orders, his authority clear. Then he stopped. He turned his head slowly and his eyes locked directly onto her hiding place. It was impossible, but he was looking right at her. He started walking toward her, his steps deliberate and certain. There was nowhere to run. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no food, no water, and no weapon. These men knew this land like the back of their own hands. She would be hunted down in minutes, so she stood up. She pushed her tangled hair out of her face and tried to find a scrap of dignity in her torn, filthy dress. As he got closer, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd thought in the heat of battle, maybe 30. A long, thin scar cut across one cheek. His eyes weren't empty like the Apaches. They were sharp, intelligent, and hard. "You are the rancher Sullivan's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Margaret could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. How could he possibly know who she was? "Your father," the warrior continued, "he traded with my people. Fair trades. He did not cheat us." The way he said "did" sent a fresh wave of grief through her. He was gone. Her father was truly gone. She pushed the tears down. She would not cry in front of this man. "I am Samuel Redwater," he said. The English name was a shock, coming from a man who looked every inch the Comanche warrior. "My mother was Mexican, taken in a raid when she was a girl. She became Comanche. She gave me that name for your world. My true name is Pita Nocona, Blue Thunder." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You will come with us." It was not an offer. It was a command. Margaret knew she had no choice. Die here alone in the desert, or go with these men. But she had to know. "As another captive?" she asked, her voice raspy but clear. Something flickered in his dark eyes. "Surprise, maybe?" "The Apache would have sold you. Or worse." "We are not Apache," he said, the distinction seeming vital to him. "You will be safe. For now." For Margaret, the difference between one kind of captivity and another was a distinction she couldn't yet understand. The journey to the Comanche camp took 3 days. They traveled through a landscape that bled from harsh desert to rolling grasslands, and finally into a land of painted canyons and towering mesas. Margaret rode a horse taken from the Apaches. Her hands were free, but she was never out of sight of at least 2 warriors. Samuel Redwater, or Blue Thunder, rode beside her for much of the journey. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to point out a hidden spring or the name of a distant butte. It was strange. He was teaching her how to survive in this land, almost without meaning to. She learned bits and pieces of his story. He'd spent time at a Spanish mission as a boy, which was where he learned his English. But he had returned to his people, to the old ways. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, much like she was now, only he seemed to walk that line with a confidence she couldn't imagine. The other warriors mostly ignored her. She was Samuel's prize, his responsibility. As long as she didn't try to run, she was not their concern. At night, they gave her a blanket and motioned for her to sleep near the horses. She was still property, but it felt different. Samuel would sometimes sit by the small fire she was allowed, not looking at her, but speaking into the flames. He told her stories of the land, of his people, of the spirits that lived in the rocks and the wind. He never asked for a response. It wasn't a conversation. It was something else. A strange, one-sided sharing in the vast, silent darkness of the plains. On the third night, camped beside a spring shaded by ancient cottonwood trees, Margaret finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been eating at her since the battle. "Why?" she said, her voice quiet. "Why did you save me? You could have let the Apache kill me." Samuel stared into the fire for a long, long time. She thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "I knew your father, before the sickness. He was different. He saw us as people, not just savages." He paused, poking the fire with a stick. "When I was a boy, maybe 15, I was separated from my band in a blizzard. I was freezing. Your father found me. He could have shot me, taken my scalp for bounty. Many would have." Margaret held her breath. "Instead," Samuel continued, "he took me to his barn. He gave me a blanket and food. When the storm passed, he pointed the way to the mountains and let me go. He never told anyone." The world tilted on its axis. Her father, a quiet, simple rancher, had done this. It changed everything. The clear, simple lines she had drawn between her world and theirs were suddenly blurred and broken. "So you saved me to repay a debt?" she asked, trying to understand. Samuel finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Perhaps, or perhaps the spirits guide our hands for reasons we cannot see. My grandfather used to say that when you save a life, you become responsible for it." The weight of his words fell on her like a physical thing. She was his responsibility now. What did that even mean? She wanted to ask more, but a deep exhaustion pulled her down. As she drifted off to sleep, she dreamed not of the raid, but of a blizzard, and of her father, young and strong, leading a half-frozen Comanche boy into the warmth and safety of their barn. The Comanche camp was a surprise. They crested a ridge, and suddenly it was there below them, nestled in the bend of a river. Dozens of hide teepees, arranged in a sprawling, organic circle. The air buzzed with life. Dogs barked, children shouted and ran to greet the returning warriors. Women looked up from their work, their eyes sharp and assessing. Margaret's arrival sent a ripple of curiosity through the camp. A white captive was not a rare sight, but the way Samuel rode beside her, not behind her, the way he treated her with a strange, detached respect, was different. It raised questions. He led her past the curious stares, directly to a teepee that stood slightly apart from the others. An old woman sat outside, her gnarled fingers working a complex pattern of beads onto a piece of soft leather. "My grandmother," Samuel said, his voice softer than Margaret had ever heard it. "She will decide what to do with you." The old woman looked up. Her face was a beautiful, terrifying map of wrinkles, each line a story of survival. She studied Margaret with an unnerving intensity, her black eyes seeming to peel back the layers of fear and grief to see what was left underneath. She spoke for a long time in Comanche, her voice a reedy song, while Samuel stood silently, listening. Margaret understood none of the words, but she understood the tone. This was a trial. Her life was being weighed in the balance. Finally, the old woman fell silent. She reached out a hand and gently touched the bruise on Margaret's temple where the war club had struck. Her fingers, rough as bark, traced the cut on her lip. Then she said something short and sharp to Samuel and turned back to her beadwork, dismissing Margaret as if she were no longer there. "She says you have spirit," Samuel translated, his voice flat. "She says you fought even when you knew you would lose. She finds this good." He looked at Margaret. "You will stay with her. You will learn our ways. If you try to run, the warriors will hunt you down and you will become an enemy. If you stay and you learn, you will be protected." Life in the camp was a strange new reality. She was not a slave, not in the way she'd feared. She was not beaten or starved, but she was not free. She was something in between, a ghost living in someone else's world. Samuel's grandmother, whose name she learned was Hupi Pahadi, tall bird woman, became her teacher and her keeper. The old woman was a patient but demanding instructor. She taught Margaret how to scrape buffalo hides until they were buttery soft, how to find the hidden roots that held water, how to stitch with sinew and an awl. She spoke no English, so Margaret was forced to learn Comanche through gestures, repetition, and the old woman's occasional dry laughter at her mistakes. The other women of the band treated her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Some had been captives themselves long ago. They were now fully Comanche with husbands and children, their old lives a distant memory. Sometimes one of them would show her a small kindness, a piece of roasted meat, a warmer spot by the fire. They taught her the most important lessons: which men to avoid, which families held power, how to navigate the complex web of relationships that held the camp together. Samuel was gone more often than he was there. He was a war chief, constantly leading hunting parties or raids, protecting the band from soldiers and other tribes. But when he was in camp, he would always find a reason to stop by his grandmother's teepee. He would sit by the fire, sharpening his arrows or mending a bridle, and he would tell stories. He spoke of Coyote the trickster and the old gods who painted the canyons. Through his stories, Margaret began to see the world through Comanche eyes. She started to understand that their way of life was not savage, but simply different. It had its own logic, its own beauty, its own strict moral code. And slowly, without her even realizing it, her feelings about Samuel began to change. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. She saw the way he played with the children, his stern warrior's face softening into a rare smile. She saw the deep, quiet respect he showed his grandmother. She started to notice other things too. The way the light caught the reddish-brown tints in his hair, a legacy of his Mexican mother. The quiet confidence in his posture, the intelligence that burned in his dark eyes. It was a dangerous, impossible feeling, and she tried to crush it, to bury it under the hard work of her new life. But it was a stubborn root growing in the dark. 3 months after her capture, a new danger appeared. A patrol of Texas Rangers, relentless and deadly, had found their trail. A battle was coming. The women and children had to be moved to a hidden canyon for safety. But Margaret was a problem. A white woman, What if she tried to signal the Rangers? What if she tried to escape in the chaos? The War Council met, their voices grim. She understood enough Comanche now to catch the drift of their debate. Some argued it was simpler to just kill her. One less risk. Samuel argued passionately for her life, but it wasn't his words that saved her. It was his grandmother. Hupipahati stood before the council, her back straight and proud, and made a proposal that silenced everyone. Margaret would not be a captive anymore. She would be adopted. She would be made Comanche through the old ceremonies. In the eyes of the spirits, she would no longer be white. The ceremony happened that very night, with the fires of the Rangers visible on the distant horizon. The women of the camp took Margaret to the river. They washed her, scrubbing away the last traces of Margaret Sullivan. They unbraided her hair and rewove it in the Comanche style. They burned her ragged dress and clothed her in soft, supple doe skin, decorated with beads that told a story she couldn't yet read. Hupi Pahadi painted her face with sacred symbols, marking her as one of them, as family. The ceremony was a dizzying blur of smoke and chanting. She drank a bitter tea that made the world spin. She danced around a fire that seemed to burn with colors she had never seen before. At the end, she had to repeat words in Comanche, words she had memorized but did not fully grasp. Words that cut the final ties to her old life and bound her to this new one. When it was over, Samuel stood before her. His expression was impossible to read. "You are Naomi now," he said quietly. "One of us. You are my grandmother's daughter. By our laws, you are now my aunt." He said the word aunt with a strange emphasis, a tension that hinted at something left unsaid. Something had shifted, not just around her, but inside her. The next day, when the Rangers attacked, Naomi hid with the other Comanche women and children, and she found herself praying not for rescue, but for the safety of the Comanche warriors, for Samuel's safety. The Rangers were driven back, but the cost was high. Several warriors were dead. The band had to flee, leaving almost everything behind. It was during that desperate journey that the river tried to claim her. They were crossing a river swollen with recent rain. Her horse stumbled on a slick rock and went down. The current, cold and powerful, grabbed her. Her heavy doe-skin dress became an anchor, pulling her down into the churning brown water. She fought, her arms and legs flailing, but the river was too strong. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Her lungs burned. Then strong hands grabbed her, hauling her from the water, dragging her onto the muddy bank. She lay there, limp, water pouring from her mouth. She wasn't breathing. Samuel's face appeared above her, his usual calm shattered by raw fear. Without a second's hesitation, he covered her mouth with his. He forced his breath into her lungs. Once, twice. He pushed on her chest, a desperate rhythm of life. On the third breath, a great shuddering convulsion racked her body. Water erupted from her lungs, and she took a ragged, screaming gasp of air. She was alive, coughing, sputtering, but alive. The entire band had stopped, watching from the bank in stunned silence. And in that silence, as he still held her shivering body against his, Samuel did something that changed everything forever. He raised his head and spoke, his voice ringing out across the water, clear and strong, for all to hear. "This woman is mine. I claim her as my wife. By the law of saved life, by the law of shared breath. She died, and I brought her back from the spirit world. She is bound to me, and I to her." The declaration was absolute. It was an ancient law, one that no one would dare challenge. Still coughing up river water, Margaret, Naomi, understood. He hadn't just saved her. He had claimed her. In front of his entire people, he had bound their lives together. That night, they sat across from each other in a small teepee that was now theirs. The air was thick with things unsaid. "You did not have to do that," she said, her Comanche still hesitant. "You could have just saved me." Samuel looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the months of restraint, of careful distance, fall away from his eyes. "When you were in the river," he said, his voice raw, "when I thought you were gone, I knew. I knew I had been lying to myself. You are not my responsibility. You are not my aunt. You are not a debt I owe my father." He moved closer, his presence filling the small space. You are the woman I want to see when I wake in the morning. You are the woman I want to fight for." Tears she didn't know she had left began to slide down her cheeks. Not tears of fear, but of a stunning, terrifying recognition. She had been lying to herself too, calling it gratitude, calling it dependency, calling it anything but what it was: love. "I don't know how to be a Comanche wife," she whispered, the words carrying all her fear of this impossible future. He took her hands, his grip warm and steady. "And I do not know how to be a husband to a white woman who became Comanche," he answered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We will learn. Together." Their first night as husband and wife was not what she had been taught to fear. It was a slow, gentle discovery. Two people from different worlds, who had been circling each other for months, finally giving in to the inevitable gravity between them. He was patient and tender, teaching her a language of the body she had never known. And in his arms, she found a passion she never knew she possessed, a deep hunger for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. Lying beside him in the dark, their bodies tangled together, she knew she had crossed a final border. There was no going back. Margaret Sullivan was gone. She was Naomi, wife of Blue Thunder. And for the first time since that terrible dawn at the ranch, she felt like she was home. Life as Samuel's wife gave her a new status in the band. She was no longer the strange white captive, but the wife of a respected war chief. Some accepted her completely. Others still watched her with suspicion, their eyes cold. So she worked harder than ever. She mastered the women's skills, but she also learned the men's. She accompanied Samuel on hunts, learning to shoot a bow from horseback, her accuracy earning her grudging respect. Their first winter was brutal. The great buffalo herds were shrinking, hunted to near extinction by the whites. The U.S. Army had a new strategy: starve the Plains tribes into submission. Game was scarce. The band was hungry. It was during a desperate hunt that the soldiers came. Samuel's hunting party was ambushed, a fierce, running battle. They escaped, but Samuel had taken a bullet high in the chest. By the time they got him back to camp, he was barely conscious, blood frothing on his lips with every shallow breath. The lung was hit. The medicine man chanted and prayed, using all his ancient knowledge, but Samuel only grew weaker. By morning, everyone knew he was dying. Everyone except Naomi. She refused to let him go. She remembered things from her old life, things her mother, who had been a healer, had taught her. She knew about cleaning wounds, about fever, about how the body fights. She took charge, combining the medicine man's sacred herbs with the practical knowledge of her past. She boiled water to keep the wound clean. But the real problem was the lung. It was collapsed. He was drowning from the inside. She remembered watching her mother treat a farmhand who had been gored by a bull. An image flashed in her mind, a hollow reed, a desperate, impossible idea. While the medicine man looked on in horror, convinced she was using evil white magic, she inserted a sharpened, hollowed-out bird bone into Samuel's chest, creating a seal with animal fat. She sucked the air from his chest cavity again and again, until with a sickening pop, the lung reinflated. For 5 days he hovered on the edge of the spirit world. Naomi never left his side. She sang to him Comanche lullabies and hymns from her childhood, her voice a constant thread pulling him back to the living. On the 6th day, his fever broke. He opened his eyes and they were clear. He looked at her. "You breathe for me," he whispered, the words in English. "As you did for me," she replied, her own voice thick with tears. Their lives were now bound by a double knot. Each had breathed life into the other. They were no longer just husband and wife. They were two halves of a single survival. During the slow weeks of Samuel's recovery, Naomi discovered she was pregnant. The news sent another shockwave through the camp. A child of a white woman made Comanche and a half-blood warrior. To some, the baby was a symbol of hope, of a new way to survive. To others, it was a dilution of the bloodline, a sign of weakness. But Hupi Pahadi, the old grandmother, declared it a great blessing, a sign that the spirits approved of their union. Samuel, still weak but mending, touched her belly with a look of pure wonder. "This child," he said, "will be a bridge between our worlds." But the world of the whites was closing in. The Red River War began, a final, brutal campaign by the army to crush the last free bands and force them onto reservations. One by one, the other Comanche bands were hunted down and destroyed. Samuel's people, using their intimate knowledge of the canyons, held out longer than most, but it was a losing fight. The buffalo were gone. The people were starving. Winter was coming. The choice was no longer about fighting or running. It was about how to surrender with some shred of dignity left. The end came when Naomi was 7 months pregnant, her belly a round promise of life in a world of death. A blizzard trapped them in a canyon, and army scouts found their camp. It was over. Surrender or be massacred. Samuel, his warrior's heart breaking, chose life for his people, for his wife, for his unborn child. He agreed to surrender, but he had one condition. He sent Naomi, his translator, to speak to the army captain. His band would lay down their arms, but she and their child were to be registered on the rolls as Comanche, not as a white captive and a half-breed. It was a tiny victory and a catastrophic defeat, but it was everything. It meant their child would have a place, a legal identity as one of the people, in the new world being forced upon them. The march to the reservation at Fort Sill was a trail of tears. Warriors who had ridden free their whole lives were now forced to walk in chains. Elders stumbled and fell, left where they lay. Hupi Pahadi died on the third day. They were not allowed to stop to bury her. Naomi walked beside Samuel, his chains clinking with every step, her hand on her swollen belly, feeling their child kick against a world that did not want it. The reservation was a prison made of mud and despair. The land was bad, the water foul. They were surrounded by soldiers who hated them. Families were broken apart, the men housed in one compound, the women and children in another. Samuel was taken away, classified as a dangerous hostile. She didn't see him again for 2 weeks. When they finally let her visit, she almost didn't recognize him. They had cut his hair. They had put him in soldier's clothes. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that scared her more than any wound. That night, in the squalid women's barracks, Naomi gave birth. With only a few other Comanche women to help, she brought their daughter into the world, a tiny screaming miracle. She had Samuel's dark hair and Naomi's bright blue eyes, a living bridge. She named her Mary for her own mother in English, and Hoshi, morning star, in Comanche. When they finally allowed Samuel to see his child, he held her and wept, the first time she had ever seen him cry. Life on the reservation was a slow, grinding death. The government rations were rotten. The blankets were thin. They were prisoners in their own land. The greatest cruelty was the schools. Agents would come and take the children, shipping them off to boarding schools far away. There they were beaten for speaking their own language. Their names were changed. Their culture was scoured from them. But even in that hell, the people resisted. In secret, Samuel began to teach the young boys the old stories, the warrior skills. Naomi, with her English, became a voice for her adopted people. She wrote letters, documenting the spoiled food, the stolen supplies, the abuses. She fought with the only weapon she had left, words. 2 years later, their son James was born, and when he was 5, the agency man came for him, to take him to the school. But they were ready. Naomi used her knowledge of white medicine to convince the agent that the boy was simple-minded, not fit for schooling. In secret, James was brilliant. He learned English from his mother and the old Comanche ways from his father. He was their secret weapon. Their daughter Mary was not so lucky. They took her when she was 5. The day the wagon came, Samuel held a secret ceremony, painting her with invisible symbols of protection. Naomi cut a lock of her hair, knowing they would shave her head at the school. She watched her daughter, so small and so brave, get into the wagon without crying, and felt her own heart break into a million pieces. The years that followed were a blur of small battles. They fought for every scrap of food, every blanket, every shred of dignity. They fought to keep their son hidden. They fought for news of their daughter. Mary's letters, written in a stilted, careful English, were smuggled out by a sympathetic teacher. They were heartbreaking, but she was not broken. She was surviving. And in their own letters back, Naomi would hide Comanche words inside English sentences. sending her daughters secret messages of love and resilience. Samuel would carve tiny wooden horses, symbols of the free life, and bribe a clerk to slip them into the supply packages. They were fighting a war for their children's souls. Slowly, things began to change. A new agent who was a Quaker, a man with a conscience. New policies from Washington that shifted from outright extermination to forced assimilation. It was still a prison, but one with slightly wider bars. Samuel learned to read and write English. Naomi became so fluent in Comanche that she sometimes dreamed in it. When Mary finally came home at 14, she was a stranger. She was quiet and cautious, her Comanche hesitant, her English perfect. But the fire was still there, deep in her blue eyes. She was a bridge, just as her father had predicted. She began to help her mother with the letters, her perfect English, a powerful tool. And at night she would sit with her father and relearn the songs and stories the school had tried to beat out of her. Their son James, the boy they had hidden, grew up to be a lawyer, the first of his people. He used the white man's law as a weapon, fighting for the treaty rights his people had been promised. He fought for them in courtrooms instead of on the battlefield. 20 years after she had been pulled from that river, Naomi sat with Samuel on the porch of their small reservation house. They were old now, worn down by the years of struggle, but they were alive. Their children were alive, and their grandchildren, playing in the dusty yard, chattered in a mixture of Comanche and English. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked. He had asked it before, many times. The river, all of it. She looked at his face, at the lines of hardship and love etched there. She took his hand. "The river knew what it was doing," she said, as she always did. "It brought me to you." As the sun set, painting the Oklahoma sky with defiant colors, she heard her grandchildren singing. It was a Comanche lullaby, but with English words. Or maybe it was a church hymn with a Comanche rhythm. She couldn't tell anymore. The lines were too blurred. And in that beautiful, mixed-up sound, she understood their victory. It wasn't in winning the war. It was in surviving it. It was in the mixing, the blending, the creation of something new and resilient from the wreckage of two worlds. Samuel squeezed her hand. "When I breathed my life into you," he said, his voice quiet, "I didn't know I was breathing life into the future of our people." Naomi looked at her granddaughter, who had her blue eyes and Samuel's proud cheekbones. "And when you claimed me as your wife," she replied, "you weren't just claiming me, you were claiming a way where love is stronger than blood." Years later, long after they were both gone, their descendants would tell their story. In the Tribal Museum, there is a photograph taken in 1892. It shows an old man and an old woman surrounded by their children and grandchildren. He wears a suit, but his gray hair is in two long braids. She wears a traditional doeskin dress, but around her neck is a small silver cross. They are not looking at the camera. They are looking at each other. And in their eyes, you can see the whole story. The fire, the river, the blood, and the breathtaking, impossible love that built a bridge across it all. If you were moved by the story of Naomi and Samuel, and you believe that love can build bridges across any divide, then hit that subscribe button. There are countless stories like this, hidden in the margins of history, and we're here to bring them into the light.